The cab rolled to a gentle stop in front of the Grand Hotel, its weathered tires crunching against the gravel drive. Juliet stared out the window, her fingers absently twisting the strap of her leather bag. The building before her was breathtaking, an elegant sprawl of white stone and arched windows perched on the edge of a cliff, with the ocean stretching endlessly beyond it. The salty breeze, laced with the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens, drifted through the open window, and for the first time in weeks she felt a flicker of something like peace. "Here we are," the driver said with a kind smile as he turned off the meter. Juliet nodded, managing a polite "thank you" as she handed him the fare, though her voice felt distant in her own ears. She stepped out onto the gravel, the cool air brushing her cheeks, and tilted her head to take in the full expanse of the hotel. Sunlight gleamed off the glass panes, glinting like a promise she wasn't sure she believed in yet. The porter greeted her warmly, reaching for her suitcase. She hesitated for a second before relinquishing it, her knuckles pale around the handle. "Welcome to Ocean View Retreat. Here for the conference?" he asked, his tone casual but friendly. "Yes," Juliet replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "The teaching seminar." He nodded with a practiced smile, guiding her through the grand double doors. The lobby was just as stunning. Marble floors polished to a mirror-like shine, towering ceilings, and a central chandelier that seemed to hold shards of the sun itself. The distant murmur of waves crashing against the cliffs filtered in through the open terrace doors. Juliet couldn't help but glance around at the other guests scattered throughout the space. Laughter echoed from a small group by the coffee bar, their faces open and untroubled. A pair of children darted past her, giggling as they chased each other. She swallowed against the lump that rose in her throat and turned her focus to the ornate reception desk. The check-in process was smooth, and soon she was clutching the keycard to her room, its cold surface pressed tight against her palm as she walked toward the elevator. She paused for a moment before stepping inside, staring at her reflection in the gilded doors. Her pale blue blouse, carefully chosen that morning, hung a little too loosely on her frame. Her hair, pulled back into a low bun, was neat but severe, and her eyes, they looked tired. She turned away quickly as the elevator chimed open. The room was beautiful, with its plush bedding and private balcony overlooking the endless stretch of ocean. Juliet let her suitcase drop by the door and stepped outside. The sound of the waves grew louder here, each crash against the rocks below steady and unrelenting. She gripped the balcony railing, inhaling deeply. For months, her chest had felt tight, as though grief and guilt had locked her inside a cage of her own making. But here, standing in the open air with the horizon stretching in every direction, she felt different. Not entirely free, but as if the bars had loosened just slightly, letting her breathe. She closed her eyes, letting the wind play with the loose strands of her hair. Coming here had been a risk, leaving behind her routines, her carefully constructed walls, but perhaps it was a necessary one. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find this week, but a quiet voice inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, she would find herself again. The low hum of the car engine faded as the taxi came to a halt in front of the Grand Hotel. Dominic glanced up from the stack of papers, balanced precariously on his lap, his brow furrowing as he took in the building before him. It was unexpected. He'd been to dozens of conference venues in his career, soulless high-rises, beige corporate chains, but this was something else. The hotel stood proud against the backdrop of the ocean, its white stone glowing faintly in the late afternoon sun, the arched windows gleaming with reflected light. For a moment, Dominic sat still, papers forgotten, staring at the elegant structure. "Nice place, huh?" the driver said, twisting in his seat with a grin. "Yeah," Dominic replied, his voice as dry as ever, though he couldn't entirely suppress the faint note of surprise in it. "Not what I was expecting." He shuffled the papers into his briefcase, snapping it shut with a decisive click before stepping out of the car. The sudden, bracing gust of sea air caught him off guard, carrying the faint tang of salt and something floral he couldn't quite place. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the briefcase handle, the other raking through his thick, dark hair as he tried to adjust to the unfamiliar setting. The porter approached with an easy smile, reaching for the small suitcase Dominic had pulled from the trunk. "Welcome to Ocean View Retreat? Here for the conference?" "Yes," Dominic said, his tone clipped out of habit. Then, realizing how brisk he sounded, he added, "The legal one." The porter nodded politely, falling into step beside him as they crossed the gravel drive and stepped through the grand double doors. Dominic couldn't help but glance around as they entered, his practiced lawyer's gaze sweeping over every detail. The place was beautiful, almost unsettlingly so. Polished marble floors stretched out beneath his feet, reflecting the intricate chandelier above that scattered light like fractured stars. Conversations murmured gently from every corner, and the faint sound of a piano drifted in from somewhere nearby. It felt wrong. Or more accurately, Dominic felt wrong here. He felt out of place, like an intruder. This wasn't the kind of setting he was used to. Cities, conference rooms, courtrooms, those were his arenas. This hotel, with its serene charm and postcard-perfect views, seemed designed to relax, to comfort. And that was something Dominic couldn't quite trust. He reached the reception desk and pulled his wallet from his jacket pocket, the flash of his late wife's photo briefly catching his eye as it always did. His chest tightened, the familiar pang settling in as he slid his credit card across the counter. "Dominic Hayes," he said, his voice steady despite the ache pressing down on him. "Checking in." The receptionist smiled warmly as she processed his reservation, but Dominic barely noticed. He was already pushing the feeling down, locking it away in the corner of his mind, reserved for things he didn't have time to deal with. He wasn't here to brood. He was here to work, to move forward, to prove, to himself if no one else, that he could keep going, that he would keep going. The room key landed softly on the counter in front of him. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Hayes," the receptionist said. He nodded curtly, pocketing the key as he turned toward the elevators. But as he stepped inside, the weight of the past year seemed to press in on him. The polished gold of the elevator doors reflecting a man who didn't quite recognize himself anymore. He adjusted his tie, a nervous tic he hated but couldn't seem to let go of, and exhaled slowly. When the doors opened onto his floor, Dominic found his room easily. It was beautiful, of course, bright and airy, with a view that stretched across the endless blue of the ocean. He set his briefcase down on the desk and stepped toward the window, loosening his tie as he went. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the waves crashing against the cliffs below. "You're here," he muttered to himself, his voice low. "That's a start." And for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might be true. "Excuse me, is this the right room for the conference?" Juliet's voice broke the quiet buzz of the room as she pushed the door open, clutching her notebook to her chest. She stopped short, blinking at the sight before her. Instead of the expected rows of chairs and a presenter fiddling with a PowerPoint, she was greeted by tables laden with cutting boards, knives, and bowls of fresh ingredients. A handful of people in aprons milled about, laughing as they chopped vegetables and arranged garnishes. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the air. She frowned, glancing at the number on the door, then back at the printed schedule in her hand. Room 204. This was supposed to be the seminar on innovative teaching strategies, right? Well, this is different. The deep, slightly amused voice came from behind her. Juliet turned to see a tall man step into the room, a briefcase in one hand and a furrowed brow on his face. He was dressed sharply, his tie slightly loosened as though he'd just stepped out of a boardroom. His striking gray eyes swept over the room with a mixture of confusion and skepticism. "Are you here for the teaching seminar too?" Juliet ventured, though something about his polished demeanor didn't scream, "Teacher." He gave her a sidelong glance, one corner of his mouth quirking upward. "Not quite, unless the conference on legal ethics suddenly involves parsley and paring knives." Juliet blinked, then looked down at her schedule again, the pieces clicking into place. Oh no, this isn't." "Good afternoon." A cheerful voice cut her off as a petite woman in a chef's coat appeared at the front of the room, clapping her hands together. "Welcome, everyone, to Cooking with Confidence. We'll be learning to prepare a 3-course meal that will impress your friends, your family, or even just yourself." Juliet felt her cheeks flush as she glanced back at the man, who raised his eyebrows at her. Cooking with confidence? He repeated under his breath, his tone drier than the white wine likely waiting in the kitchen. I think we're in the wrong place, she whispered, her voice a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. You think? He deadpanned, though there was a glimmer of humor in his eyes. They both took an awkward step back toward the door, but before they could escape, the chef's enthusiastic gaze landed on them. You two. Perfect timing. Grab an apron and join the fun. Juliet froze, her notebook clutched tighter to her chest, while the man beside her let out a quiet, resigned sigh. Looks like we've been drafted, he murmured, setting his briefcase down by the wall. Wait, you're staying? Juliet asked, incredulous. He shrugged, his expression almost playful now. Well, I've already embarrassed myself by walking in. Might as well see what this is about. Besides, he added, lowering his voice, I'm curious to see if you're as bad at chopping onions as I am. Juliet couldn't help it. A small laugh escaped her, surprising both of them. She hesitated for another moment before setting her notebook down and reaching for an apron. Okay, she said, tying it around her waist. But if I end up accidentally poisoning us, you're to blame for convincing me to stay. The man chuckled, extending a hand. Dominic, and noted. Juliet, she replied, shaking his hand. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight on her chest ease just slightly. All right, everyone, the chef called, holding up a knife with a flourish. Let's get started. As they took their places at one of the tables, Dominic leaned closer. For the record, if anyone ends up poisoned, it's probably going to be me. Just a heads up. Juliet bit back another laugh, shaking her head as they picked up their knives. The awkwardness of the mix-up faded, replaced by something lighter, easier. And as the two of them traded quips over poorly diced vegetables and a rather unfortunate attempt at whisking, Juliet couldn't help but think that maybe mistakes weren't so bad after all. All right, the chef said with a grin, hands on her hips as she surveyed the room. Let's split into pairs. Cooking is always more fun with a partner. Juliet hesitated, glancing sideways at Dominic, who was wiping his hands on an apron he had half-heartedly tied around his waist. His tie, now askew, dangled perilously close to the counter, and there was a faint smudge of flour on his sleeve. He didn't seem to care, or maybe he didn't notice. Looks like we're stuck together, Dominic said, his tone wry as he caught her glance. Unless you're planning to abandon ship. Juliet allowed herself a small smile, though she still felt a flicker of self-consciousness. Well, you did say you're bad at chopping onions, she replied. Someone has to make sure you don't lose a finger. Generous of you, he said with a mock solemnity, stepping closer to their shared station. I guess this means you're taking the lead. She blinked at him. Why me? You have the notebook, he pointed out, nodding toward the spiral-bound pad she had set aside on the counter. I'm going to assume you're the organized one here. Juliet laughed softly, shaking her head as the chef began to explain the first dish, a bright, summery pasta with lemon, herbs, and shrimp. The instructions were simple enough, but as Juliet flipped open her notebook, jotting down a few notes out of habit, Dominic leaned closer, peering over her shoulder. You're really writing this down? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, feeling her cheeks warm. Force of habit. Teachers are supposed to be prepared, right? Impressive, he said, his tone teasing but not unkind. I usually just wing it and hope for the best. Juliet glanced at him, her lips twitching upward. That sounds risky. Sometimes it works, he said with a shrug. Sometimes it doesn't. She tilted her head. And if it doesn't? Dominic picked up the chef's knife, turning it over in his hands like he was testing its weight. Then you improvise, he said, flashing her a quick smile. The answer hung in the air for a moment, heavier than it should have been. Juliet hesitated, feeling a strange tug of understanding in his words, but before the silence could stretch too long, he gestured to the pile of vegetables in front of them. Shall we? She nodded, picking up her own knife. Carefully, she began slicing the zucchini, her movements precise and methodical. Dominic, meanwhile, attacked a handful of parsley with the kind of focus that suggested he was trying very, very hard not to make a mess. Okay, not bad, Juliet said, glancing at his pile of roughly chopped herbs. Not bad, he repeated, feigning offense. That's high praise coming from someone who's clearly a professional. She laughed, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. I'm not a professional, I just like to follow directions. Must make your students' lives easy, Dominic said, his tone light but curious. Sometimes, she admitted, but kids don't always follow directions, so I've learned to get creative. Sounds like we have something in common, he said, his knife pausing mid-chop. Juliet raised an eyebrow. Creative cooking? Creative problem-solving, he clarified. Though I'll admit my clients aren't usually as unpredictable as children. She smiled again, this time more easily. I don't know. Adults can be pretty unpredictable, too, he chuckled, nodding in agreement. Fair point. For a while, they worked in companionable silence, the hum of conversation and clatter of knives filling the room. Juliet found herself relaxing, the tension she'd carried since arriving at the hotel slowly ebbing away. There was something oddly reassuring about having a task to focus on, her hands busy while her mind wandered. Dominic, she realized, had a similar energy, calm and steady, but with a sharpness that showed itself in the occasional quip or quick smile. He didn't seem to mind that she wasn't particularly chatty, and she appreciated that he didn't push. Okay, team, the chef called, clapping her hands. Time to sauté the shrimp. Who's feeling brave? Juliet froze, her knife poised above a lemon. Go ahead, Dominic said, stepping back with a smirk. Show us how it's done. Me? You're the one who follows directions, remember? She narrowed her eyes at him, but there was no malice in it. Fine, she said, reaching for the pan. But if this goes up in flames, it's on you. Noted, he said, folding his arms as he watched her. To Juliet's surprise, the shrimp didn't burn, or at least not too badly. Dominic offered a low whistle of approval as she plated the pasta, and she shook her head, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. See, he said, lifting his fork. Improvisation. Not so bad after all. Juliet tilted her head, her gaze meeting his. Maybe. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe wasn't such a bad place to start. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the hotel grounds as Juliet and Dominic stepped out onto the stone path that wound through the gardens. The ocean stretched vast and shimmering in the distance, its surface catching the light like shattered glass. A gentle breeze carried the tang of salt and the faintest scent of jasmine. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them companionable as they walked side by side. Juliet trailed her fingers over the low hedge lining the path, its leaves cool and waxy beneath her touch. It's beautiful here, she said softly, her voice almost lost beneath the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Dominic glanced her way, his hands shoved into the pockets of his trousers. Yeah, he agreed after a moment. His tone was quieter than usual, lacking its usual edge of humor. Not quite what I expected when I signed up for a conference. Juliet smiled faintly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Me neither. I thought I'd be stuck in a windowless room all week, staring at slideshows about lesson plans. Instead, you got a culinary disaster class, Dominic teased, his lips curving into a small smile. And a partner who doesn't know how to hold a knife, she shot back, surprising herself with the ease of her response. His laugh was low and genuine, and it warmed something inside her. They reached a fork in the path, and Dominic motioned toward a narrow trail that led up a small hill. Let's see what's up there. Juliet hesitated for a moment before nodding, following him. The incline was gentle but enough to quicken her breath, and when they reached the top, she was glad she hadn't turned back. The hill overlooked the cliffs, the hotel, and the endless expanse of ocean beyond. A wooden bench sat nestled beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches casting dappled shadows over the grass. Dominic gestured toward the bench. Shall we? Juliet sat carefully, smoothing her skirt as she looked out at the view. The waves rolled in below them, steady and unrelenting, and the horizon seemed to stretch forever. It's hard to believe places like this exist, she murmured. So peaceful. Dominic leaned back, his arm draped casually over the bench's backrest. His tie was gone and his sleeves were rolled up now, giving him a slightly disheveled look that made him seem less like the sharp, composed lawyer she'd first met and more real. Peaceful's not usually my speed, he admitted. I'm more used to chaos. She glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her blue-gray eyes. Chaos? He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Courtrooms, deadlines, clients who think you can fix their entire lives with one well-worded argument. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. It keeps me busy, keeps me distracted. Juliet didn't reply right away, sensing the weight behind his words. She turned back to the ocean, the breeze catching a few strands of her hair and tugging them loose from her bun. Distraction can be useful, she said carefully, at least for a while. Dominic's eyes shifted to her, studying her profile as she spoke. You sound like you know what I mean. She hesitated, her fingers knotting together in her lap. For a moment, she thought about brushing the comment aside. But something about the open air, and the man sitting beside her made her feel less guarded than usual. I do, she admitted softly. She faltered, her voice catching. My husband passed. I threw myself into work. It was the only thing I knew how to do. The words hung between them, carried gently away by the wind. Dominic didn't interrupt or push, and Juliet felt strangely grateful for the space he gave her. It's been almost a year, she continued after a moment, but sometimes it still feels like it was yesterday, like he just disappeared, and I'm the one left trying to figure out what to do next. When she finally looked at Dominic, his expression was steady, but filled with a quiet understanding. She wondered how he could look at her like that, like he truly got it, when most people just offered clumsy condolences. I lost my wife 2 years ago, he said softly, his voice rough around the edges. Car accident. 1 minute she was there, and the next... Juliet's breath caught, her chest tightening. I'm so sorry. Me too, he said simply. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The rawness in his voice said it all. They sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of their shared grief settling over them like the fading warmth of the sun. But it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt grounding, as though acknowledging the pain, saying it aloud, made it a little less suffocating. It's strange, Juliet said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought coming here would help me get away from it, from everything, but maybe that's not possible. Dominic's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. Maybe we're not supposed to get away from it. Maybe we're just supposed to figure out how to live with it. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. Do you think we can? He held her gaze, and for the first time since they'd met, the teasing light in his eyes was replaced by something solemn and searching. I don't know, he admitted, but I think maybe we don't have to figure it out alone. The words were quiet but steady, and Juliet felt something shift in her. The walls she'd built around herself didn't crumble, but they loosened just a little, letting the breeze in. She didn't know what that meant yet, but for now, it was enough. The lobby was quiet in the late evening, the earlier bustle of guests replaced by a subdued hum of activity. The soft glow of sconces lit the room in golden light, and the faint sound of waves crashing against the cliffs seeped in through the open terrace doors. Juliet lingered by an oversized armchair near the far wall, her notebook resting unopened on her lap. She wasn't sure why she hadn't gone up to her room yet. Maybe it was the quiet, or the way the ocean air seemed heavier at night, blanketing the space in a calm she didn't want to leave just yet. She glanced toward the grand piano near the center of the lobby. It had stood unused all day, its glossy black surface reflecting the light like still water. But now someone sat at the bench, his back straight, head bowed slightly, hands poised just above the keys. Dominic. She recognized the broad line of his shoulders, the way his dark hair fell slightly out of place. He hadn't noticed her, or if he had, he gave no indication. Juliet shifted slightly in her seat, unsure if she should stay or go, but before she could decide, the first delicate notes filled the air. It was a melody she didn't recognize, soft and tentative at first, like a question. Dominic's fingers moved across the keys with a grace she didn't expect from him, his usual sharp wit and controlled demeanor replaced by something raw, unguarded. The music swelled gently, rising and falling like the ocean tides, each note spilling into the next with aching precision. Juliet's breath caught in her throat. There was something deeply intimate about the way he played, as though he wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't even aware of his surroundings. It was just him and the music, the unspoken emotions he poured into each chord filling the space between them. She felt as though she were intruding on something private, but couldn't bring herself to look away. The melody shifted, deepening, the notes heavier now, weighted with an unmistakable sadness. It was grief, not loud or messy, but quiet, steady, and unrelenting. The kind of grief that had no words, that lingered in the spaces between conversations and slipped into your thoughts when you least expected it. Juliet felt her chest tighten, her fingers curling around the edge of her notebook. Dominic's hands moved faster, the music building to something more urgent, more searching. The intensity in his playing was almost startling, the way his body leaned into the keys, his movements precise but fervent. It was as though he were trying to say all the things he couldn't say aloud, pouring everything he had into the music, letting it speak for him. Juliet's eyes stung, and she blinked, surprised by the sudden rush of emotion. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself, her pain, her loneliness, until now. The music seemed to reach into her, tugging at the pieces she'd kept locked away, coaxing them into the open. She pressed a hand to her chest, as though that might steady the ache growing there. As the piece neared its end, the music softened again, returning to the gentle, tentative notes it had started with. Dominic's hands lingered on the keys, the final chord stretching out like a sigh before fading into silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. The lobby was still, the only sound the distant crash of waves outside. Juliet realized she'd been holding her breath and exhaled slowly, her heartbeat unsteady in her chest. Dominic sat back slightly, his hands resting on his knees as he stared down at the keys. He didn't look up, didn't seem to notice anyone around him. Juliet hesitated, unsure if she should leave him to his solitude, but something in her wouldn't let her. Quietly, she rose from her seat, her notebook forgotten as she crossed the room. Her footsteps were soft against the marble floor, but Dominic must have sensed her presence because he glanced up, his expression unreadable. "That was," she began, then faltered, searching for the right words. "Beautiful." He smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, it's something I've been working on." Juliet nodded, her gaze flickering to the piano. "Does it have a name?" Dominic shook his head, his fingers brushing absently over the edge of the keys. "Not yet. I just play what I feel, I guess." Her chest tightened again at the quiet vulnerability in his voice. It sounded like she hesitated, unsure if she was overstepping. Like you were saying something important. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw everything he'd poured into the music, the loss, the longing, the fight to keep moving forward even when it felt impossible. "Maybe I was," he said softly. Juliet swallowed hard, her throat tight. It reminded me of something. It made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time." She dropped her gaze, embarrassed by her own honesty. "I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to," Dominic said, his voice steady. "I think that's the point." Their eyes met again, and for the first time, Juliet didn't feel the need to look away. For a brief, fragile moment, the space between them seemed to close, their shared pain binding them together like a melody neither of them quite understood, but both recognized all the same. And for now, that was enough. The hotel ballroom was alive with chatter and soft music, the sound of clinking glasses and laughter reverberating beneath the high vaulted ceilings. A chandelier overhead sparkled like a galaxy of stars, casting warm light over the bustling crowd. Juliet stood near the edge of the room, one hand gripping the stem of her champagne flute while the other fidgeted with the hem of her dress. She wasn't used to events like this, so much noise, energy, and attention, and she felt the familiar tug of anxiety in her chest. Dominic was beside her, as calm and self-assured as ever. He held his own glass loosely, the collar of his crisp shirt unbuttoned just enough to suggest he wasn't taking the evening too seriously. His easy demeanor should have been reassuring, but it only made Juliet feel more out of place. "You doing okay?" he asked, leaning in slightly so his voice carried over the hum of the room. His gray eyes searched hers, warm but sharp as if he could sense her discomfort. Juliet forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. She took a quick sip of champagne, hoping it might settle her nerves. "You know," Dominic said, tilting his head, "if you wanted to make a break for it, I'd cover for you. Create a distraction or something." She couldn't help but laugh softly at that, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. and leave you to fend for yourself? I'd feel too guilty." "I appreciate your sense of duty," he replied with a smirk, raising his glass in a mock toast. "But seriously, we don't have to stay long." Before Juliet could respond, the MC took the stage near the front of the room, tapping a microphone to get the crowd's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his booming voice cutting through the noise, "thank you for joining us tonight for this special event. We have a few announcements to make, but first, let's hear from some of our wonderful guests about their experiences here at Ocean View Retreat." Juliet's grip on her glass tightened as a ripple of polite applause spread through the room. The MC continued, scanning the crowd with an enthusiastic grin. "How about you right there?" He pointed directly at her. Her heart plummeted. "Me?" she stammered, her voice barely audible over the buzz of the room. "Yes, you!" the MC said brightly, motioning for her to step forward. "Come on up, don't be shy." Juliet's cheeks burned as all eyes turned toward her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and vanish. Dominic leaned close, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Just say no, or we can leave, right now." But before she could process his words, the MC's encouraging smile and the weight of the crowd's expectant gaze propelled her forward. Her legs felt like lead as she made her way to the stage, her mind racing. She hadn't prepared for this. What was she supposed to say? "Wonderful," the MC said as she reached the microphone. "Tell us your name and a little about what brought you here." Juliet's fingers trembled as she took the mic, her voice shaky as she said, I'm Juliet." Her gaze darted to Dominic, who gave her a small, reassuring nod from the back of the room. She clung to that as she continued. I'm here for the teaching seminar." There was an encouraging murmur from the audience, but Juliet's throat felt dry, her chest tight. Her thoughts blurred together, and the words coming out of her mouth felt disconnected from her brain. "It's been, really great so far. The hotel is beautiful, and then it happened." As she shifted nervously on the stage, her foot caught the edge of a cord snaking along the floor. She stumbled, the microphone jerking out of her hand and letting out a shrill burst of feedback that made everyone wince. The champagne flute she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered against the stage with a loud, echoing crash. "Oh my God," she whispered, mortified as gasps and startled laughter rippled through the crowd. The MC rushed to help her, but the damage was done. Juliet's face burned with humiliation as she fumbled to pick up the microphone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it again. A few people clapped awkwardly, trying to encourage her, but the sound felt hollow and pitying. I'm sorry," she stammered into the mic, her voice cracking. I should go." Without waiting for a response, she handed the microphone back to the MC and hurried off the stage, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Dominic was already moving toward her, concern etched into his features, but Juliet shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "I need to go," she mumbled, brushing past him. "Juliet, wait," he started, but she didn't stop. She fled the ballroom, her chest heaving as she pushed through the double doors and into the quiet hallway. The laughter and applause from inside felt like a slap to her already fragile composure. Tears pricked at her eyes as she hurried toward the elevator, her humiliation washing over her in waves. When Dominic caught up with her moments later, she had already pressed the button for her floor. "Juliet," he said softly, his voice steady but pleading. "It's not as bad as you think." "Please," she interrupted, her voice breaking. I need to be alone." The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside, refusing to look at him as the doors closed. As they did, she felt the heavy weight of the walls she'd worked so hard to loosen slamming back into place. Dominic sat alone in the hotel's lounge, a low fire crackling in the stone hearth across from him. The room was hushed, the kind of quiet that lingered after a crowd had dispersed, but hadn't yet surrendered completely to the pull of sleep. His tie was off, crumpled somewhere in his pocket, and his sleeves remained rolled up from earlier in the evening. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the faint light of the fire. But he hadn't taken a sip in a while. His thoughts were elsewhere, his gray eyes fixed on the flames. He replayed the scene from the ballroom in his mind, the way Juliet had stood on that stage, all raw nerves and trembling hands. She had looked so out of place, so vulnerable under the weight of all those expectant eyes. And then the stumble, the crash of glass, the wide-eyed panic as her composure shattered right along with it. She'd fled before he could stop her, her pain written plainly on her face, and the memory of it tugged at something deep inside him now, something familiar. Dominic let out a slow breath, leaning forward in his chair and resting his elbows on his knees. He thought about the way she'd avoided his gaze when he'd tried to follow her, the way her voice had cracked as she'd asked, no, practically begged, to be left alone. He hated that she'd felt that way, hated that he hadn't been able to stop it, to fix it. But more than that, he hated how much it reminded him of himself. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, his thumb brushing the faint edge of stubble. He hadn't expected to find someone like Juliet here, someone who could make him feel again after 2 years of carefully locking every emotion behind polished smiles and courtroom bravado. It had taken him by surprise, the way she'd slowly drawn him in with her quiet humor, her steady kindness, her guarded but undeniable warmth. He'd thought they'd been making progress, that he'd been helping her come out of her shell the way she seemed to somehow be helping him. But tonight had been a step backward. He exhaled sharply, leaning back against the chair and staring up at the ceiling. He recognized that look in her eyes when she'd left, that weight she carried. It was the same weight he carried, the same walls he'd built after losing his wife. And he hated to think of Juliet retreating into those walls again, shutting herself off from the world the way he had for so long. But Dominic wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He never had been. He didn't give up on cases, he didn't give up on people, and he sure as hell wasn't going to give up on Juliet. Not now. Not when he'd seen the way she'd started to let herself laugh with him, let herself soften in those small, unguarded moments they'd shared. She deserved more than this. More than the pain she was carrying, more than the isolation she'd wrapped herself in. And he wasn't entirely sure what he deserved, but he knew he didn't want to lose whatever it was they'd begun to build together. He straightened in his seat, setting the glass down on the low table in front of him with a decisive clink. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. He could already tell that much. But that didn't matter. Nothing worth having was ever easy, and Juliet was worth it. He was sure of that. Dominic pushed himself to his feet, his jaw tightening with quiet determination as he paced to the window. The ocean gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its waves rolling in steady and unrelenting, and he felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him as he stared into the distance. He needed to find a way to get through to her, to show her that tonight didn't have to define them, that she didn't have to face her pain alone. But how? His thoughts turned to the afternoon they'd spent walking the hotel grounds, the way her face had lit up when they'd reached the hill overlooking the cliffs. And then it hit him. The way her eyes had lingered on the water, the way she'd mentioned, almost offhandedly, her love of sailing. He remembered the pull in his own chest at her words, the echo of something he hadn't let himself think about in years, the boat he'd stopped sailing after his wife's death, the freedom he'd once felt on the open water, and the way he'd pushed it aside, thinking he didn't deserve it anymore. Maybe the ocean was the answer. Maybe that shared connection, that shared yearning for the open sea, was the key. Dominic nodded slowly to himself, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. He didn't know if Juliet would be willing to meet him there, to take that step, but he was going to try. He'd find a way to talk to her, to convince her to take a chance, not just on sailing, but on him, on them, on the possibility of something more than pain. The waves crashed in the distance, steady and unrelenting, and Dominic let their rhythm ground him. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow he'd find her, and this time, he wouldn't let her slip away. The late morning sun cast a warm, golden sheen over the marina, the water shimmering with small, restless waves that reflected the light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Juliet stood at the edge of the dock, her fingers loosely gripping the railing as she gazed out at the horizon. The air was rich with the mingling scents of salt, seaweed, and freshly varnished wood. Boats of every size bobbed gently in their slips, their sails furled, waiting for the wind to pull them toward freedom. Dominic appeared beside her, his footsteps soft on the sun-bleached planks. He carried his usual calm energy, though today it was tinged with something softer, almost hesitant. "Didn't think I'd find you down here," he said, his voice quiet but edged with curiosity. Juliet glanced at him, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I needed some air," she said simply, her tone breezy, but her grip on the railing tightened subtly. "I didn't realize the hotel had access to the marina." "It's part of the retreat package," Dominic replied, looking out at the boats. His gaze lingered on a sleek white sloop docked nearby, its name, Serendipity, painted in faded navy script along the hull. For a moment he seemed far away, caught in some memory. Then he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You sail?" Juliet hesitated, her eyes darting back to the water. "I used to," she said softly. "My husband and I had a boat. Nothing fancy, just a little cruiser. But we loved it. Being out there..." She gestured toward the open water, her voice trailing off. "It's like the rest of the world disappears, just you and the wind." Dominic was quiet for a beat, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, the word heavy with understanding. "I know what you mean." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the railing. "My wife and I used to sail too. We got a small boat right after we got married, spent every free weekend out on the water. After she..." He paused, exhaling slowly. "After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. It's been sitting in storage ever since." Juliet turned to him, her expression softening as she studied his face. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely, the words instinctive but genuine. "It's hard to go back to something that feels so tied to." She didn't finish, but Dominic didn't need her to. He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the gentle lapping of the waves filling the silence. Then Dominic straightened and looked at her, a small, almost mischievous glint in his gray eyes. "What if we changed that?" he asked. Juliet blinked. "Changed what?" "Both of us," he said, motioning to the boats. "What if we stopped letting the water win? Took one of these out, just for a little while." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't know, Dominic. It's been years. I'm not even sure I remember how to tack." He grinned, the playful confidence she'd come to expect from him returning. "Good thing I do." He gestured toward the marina rental office. "Come on, no pressure, but maybe we could both use a reminder that not everything has to hurt." Juliet hesitated, the suggestion hovering between them like a fragile bird. Part of her wanted to say no, to retreat from the idea of stepping back into something so intimately tied to her past. But another part, a quieter, braver part, was drawn to the thought of feeling the wind on her face again, the spray of the water, the quiet rhythm of the waves beneath her feet. Finally, she nodded, a tentative smile ghosting across her lips. "Okay," she said, "but if we capsize, it's your fault." Dominic laughed as he led the way toward the rental office. "Deal. Just don't say I didn't warn you. I'm not great at following directions." Juliet followed, her heart beating a little faster than usual. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to feel something other than loss. Something small, something hopeful, something that felt like a beginning. The boat skimmed across the water, the soft hiss of the waves against the hull mingling with the creak of the ropes and the occasional snap of the sail catching the wind. The sun hung high in the sky, its golden light reflecting off the endless expanse of blue. Juliet stood at the bow, her hands gripping the edge of the railing as the breeze whipped her hair free from its loose braid. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool spray of salt water kiss her cheeks, and felt something she hadn't in a long time, a quiet, steady sort of calm. "All right, Captain," Dominic called from the stern, his voice carrying over the wind. "How's the view up there?" Juliet turned, a soft smile tugging at her lips. He was standing at the tiller, his sleeves rolled up and his dark hair ruffled by the breeze. The ease in his posture was contagious, and she felt herself relax just a little more. "Not bad," she called back, "though I think I'm starting to remember why I don't wear skirts on boats." Dominic chuckled, his laugh low and warm. "Practicality is key," he replied, "but I think you're pulling it off." She rolled her eyes, but the faint blush that rose to her cheeks betrayed her. Turning back to the horizon, she let her gaze sweep over the water, the sunlight dancing on its surface like scattered diamonds. It had been years since she'd been out on the open sea, and yet it felt as though no time had passed at all. The steady rhythm of the waves beneath her feet, the tug of the wind in the sails, it was familiar in a way that made her chest ache and swell all at once. "Want to take the tiller for a while?" Dominic's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked over her shoulder to see him gesturing toward the helm. Her instinct was to shake her head, to retreat into the safety of watching instead of doing. But then she saw the way he was looking at her, calm, steady, without a hint of pressure, and something inside her shifted. Taking a breath, she nodded and made her way back to him, her steps careful as the boat rocked gently beneath her. Dominic stepped aside, his hand brushing hers briefly as he passed her the tiller. "It's all yours," he said, his voice soft but encouraging. Juliet hesitated, her fingers wrapping around the smooth wooden handle. The last time she'd held a tiller, she hadn't been alone. She could feel the weight of that memory pressing against her, but she didn't let it stop her. With a small adjustment, the boat turned slightly, catching the wind just right, and a quiet thrill shot through her. "See?" Dominic said, watching her with a faint smile. "You've still got it." She allowed herself a small laugh, glancing at him. "It's coming back to me," she admitted. Slowly. They worked together, falling into an easy rhythm. Dominic adjusted the sails while Juliet steered, their movements wordless but in sync. The quiet between them was comfortable, filled with the sound of the waves and the occasional seabird calling overhead. As the boat cut through the water, Juliet felt something she hadn't in what felt like forever: light, free. At one point, Dominic leaned against the railing beside her, his arm brushing hers. "You're different out here," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Juliet glanced at him, her expression curious. "Different how?" "Lighter," he said simply, turning to meet her eyes. "Like you're finally letting yourself breathe." She was quiet for a moment, the truth of his words settling over her like the sun's warmth. "Maybe I am," she said at last, her voice soft. "It's easier out here. Out here, it feels like maybe it's okay to let go. Just a little." Dominic nodded, his gray eyes steady on hers. "Then we'll stay out as long as you need." It was such a simple thing to say, but it meant more to her than she could put into words. For the first time in a long time, Juliet felt the weight of her walls loosening just a little more. And as they sailed on, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to navigate this alone. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the ocean in hues of amber and rose as its waves lapped gently against the cliffs. The Grand Hotel stood silhouetted against the evening sky, its arched windows glowing softly with warm golden light. From the terrace overlooking the grounds, Juliet leaned on the stone balustrade, her eyes fixed on the distant line where the water met the sky. The breeze tugged at the loose strands of her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine and salt. Dominic stepped up beside her quietly, his hands resting lightly on the railing. He didn't say anything at first, letting the silence between them settle like a second skin. It was a silence Juliet had come to appreciate, not heavy, not awkward, but full of understanding. The kind of silence that felt safe. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said at last, his voice low and steady. Juliet turned her head, studying his profile. The lines of his face, etched with both grief and resilience, seemed softer in the fading light. "It is," she murmured. "I didn't realize how much I'd missed this, watching the world slow down for a moment." Dominic glanced at her then, his lips curving into a small smile. "You're allowed to slow down, you know, to just be." Her gaze dropped to the stone railing, her fingers brushing over its cool surface. "It's harder than it sounds," she admitted, her voice quiet. "For so long, I felt like if I stopped, everything would catch up to me, the pain, the guilt, all of it. But you didn't stop," he said gently. "You kept going, and now you're here." She looked up at him, something in his tone catching her attention. "And what about you?" she asked. "Have you stopped, or are you still running?" Dominic's smile faltered, his gray eyes darkening slightly as he looked away. "I was running," he admitted after a beat, "for a long time. But then I met someone who reminded me what it's like to face the world again, to let it in." He turned back to her, his gaze steady and unguarded. "She made me realize it's okay to hold on to the past, as long as it doesn't stop you from reaching for the future. Juliet felt her breath catch. The sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his eyes, it was disarming. She'd spent so long bracing herself against the world, against the risk of opening her heart again. But here, with Dominic, it didn't feel so risky. It felt possible. As if sensing her hesitation, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers on the railing. "Juliet," he said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You don't have to face it alone. Not anymore." She studied his hand, the roughness of his knuckles, the quiet strength in his touch. Slowly, she turned her palm upward, letting her fingers intertwine with his. Her chest felt tight, not with fear, but with something warm, something hopeful. The sound of laughter drifted up from the gardens below, the faint strains of a string quartet playing from the ballroom. The world seemed to glow, alive with possibility. Juliet tilted her head, a smile breaking through her uncertainty. "Maybe," she said, her voice steady now, "maybe it's time to stop running." Dominic's smile widened, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Together they turned back to the horizon, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. And as the first stars began to prick the sky, Juliet let herself believe, for the first time in what felt like forever, that the future might just be worth embracing.